Most investors still think the AI story is mainly about chips. They are late. The chip story is real. It is just no longer the whole story. Once everybody knows the shovel is valuable, the smarter question becomes this: who owns the road, the fuel, the wire, the cooling, and the power needed to keep the shovels working? That is where the game gets more interesting. And that is where most ordinary investors are still blind. They look at NVIDIA, they look at model releases, they look at chatbots, they look at valuation arguments, and whether a stock already ran too far fine. But while they are staring at the glamorous layer, something more primitive and more profitable is happening underneath. AI is colliding with electricity, not metaphorically, physically. And whenever a new technology wave collides with a physical bottleneck, the biggest money often migrates away from the flashy surface and into the people who can relieve the bottleneck. That is the first thing I want you to understand. A boom becomes much more investable once you find the real choke point. And the choke point now is power. That is the first mechanism. I call it the chip illusion. The chip illusion happens when a theme gets so visually tied to one set of winners that investors stop asking what the winners themselves depend on. AI chips need data centers need cooling. Cooling needs electricity. Electricity needs generation, transmission, switching, control, backup, and raw materials. That stack is not optional. It is not a story preference. It is physics. And physics usually beats fashion in the end. That is why I do not like chasing a theme at the level where the crowd is already screaming. I like dropping one layer lower and asking what the crowd's favorite winners will have to buy whether they want to or not. That is where the money gets colder and better. The second mechanism is the unavoidable spend. The White House, as the 8th of April, 2025 Executive Order on Grid Reliability explicitly framed electric grid reliability and security as national policy and used emergency authorities to address generation adequacy and reliability risks. The White House fact sheet said the order allows federal action to preserve critical generation resources and support reliable power for key facilities. That matters not because one executive order solves the grid. It does not. It matters because once the federal government publicly treats grid reliability as strategic infrastructure, the conversation changes from maybe we should invest more to we do not really have the luxury of pretending this can wait. And when a problem moves from optional to unavoidable, capital follows. That is the whole follow the money lesson in one line. Do not follow the hottest headline. Follow the spend that can no longer be avoided. AI power demand is moving into that category. The Department of Energy has said data center deployment is a major near-term electricity demand driver, and it cites EPRI's estimate that data centers could consume up to 9% of U.S. electricity generation by 2030. The IEA's 2026 Energy and AI Analysis also says data center electricity consumption is set to more than double by 2030, with the United States accounting for the largest share of the increase. That is not a side issue. That is the issue. And it gets even more serious when you combine that with the age of the existing infrastructure. The DOE said in April 2026 that more than 70% of the country's transformers are at least 25 years old, and another 15% are more than 40 years old. That is the third mechanism. I call it the ancient grid problem. People talk about the grid as though it were some invisible permanent backdrop, like gravity. It is not. It is hardware. It gets old. It breaks. It bottlenecks. It gets overwhelmed by new load patterns it was never designed for. An old transformer does not care that AI is fashionable. A transmission bottleneck does not care that a data center campus has investor presentations and political support. The wire either carries the load or it does not. That is why I keep saying the AI story is moving from software fantasy into industrial reality. Industrial reality has a different cast of winners, not only the glamorous platform companies, also the people who build cool, power, connect, route, and upgrade the systems those platforms require. Now we get to the most important shift of all. The fourth mechanism is the off-grid scramble. When demand rises faster than grid access, Companies stop waiting politely. They improvise. They secure power directly. They build around the bottleneck. Reuters reported in April 2026 that some data center developers were already relying on gas-fired on-site generation because transmission bottlenecks and load growth were outpacing the existing grid. That is not a trivial detail. That is a regime change. Private companies are beginning to behave less like passive utility customers and more like power strategists. Once that happens, the list of winners broadens immediately. You are no longer only talking about regulated utilities. You are talking about on-site power, backup systems, fuel cells, small modular reactors, thermal management, electrical distribution, engineering and construction, transmission upgrades, transformer resilience, aluminum and copper demand, uranium demand, gas infrastructure. That is why lazy investors miss the trade. They keep looking for one ticker that symbolizes the entire theme. The real money usually spreads through an ecosystem, and ecosystems are harder to summarize, which is why television does a bad job with them. But difficult to summarize does not mean difficult to profit from. It simply means you need a better framework. That brings us to the fifth mechanism. I call it the backlog proof. Talk is cheap. Backlog is not a dream. It is not a social media thread. It is not a CEO saying demand is robust. It is signed work. That is why I love backlog and themes like this. Because once the market starts rewarding grid names, every amateur suddenly has a story. Every newsletter has a top 5 list. Every video has a dog and a whiteboard and a feeling. Backlog cuts through the noise. Quanta Services is a good example. Its investor materials showed $44 billion of total backlog as of the 31st of December 2025. And recent reporting says backlog reached $48.5 billion in Q1 2026, the highest in company history. That does not guarantee the stock goes up tomorrow. That is not what I am saying. What it tells you is that the work is real. The need is real. The contracts are real. The spending is not theoretical. And in infrastructure themes, reality matters more than rhetoric. That is why the companies I respect most in this setup are not necessarily the ones with the prettiest story. They are the ones with the most visible claim on unavoidable work. Some build the long-distance arteries, some build substations, some build power plants, some build the switching and distribution gear, some solve cooling, some convert power, some supply the nuclear fuel or other critical inputs, some benefit from transmission, material demand, different layer, same river of spending. The sixth mechanism is the second derivative winner. Everyone notices the obvious beneficiary first. Then, if the theme is real enough, the spending moves one layer lower and starts rewarding the less obvious supplier class. That is often where the best risk-reward shows up because the crowd has not fully priced the second-order dependency yet. If data centers need more on-site power, then fuel cell providers matter. If fuel cells and substations proliferate, then power conversion specialists matter. If thermal density keeps rising, cooling specialists matter. If transmission upgrades accelerate, switchgear, electrical components, and specialty materials matter. If nuclear interest rises, uranium and fuel, cycle exposure matter. This is not mystical. It is just industrial logic. And industrial logic is one of the few places left where ordinary investors can still build an edge just by thinking one layer deeper than the first crowd. Now let me give you the 7 sectors I would force myself to see clearly in a theme like this. First, on-site power generation. Bloom Energy's April 2026 release said Oracle intends to procure up to 2.8 gigawatts of Bloom fuel, sell systems under an expanded master services agreement to support AI and cloud infrastructure. You do not need to own Bloom to understand what that means. It proves the behavior. The customer is not waiting. The power need is not optional. The willingness to contract directly is real. Second, grid builders, the people who physically expand transmission, substations, and related infrastructure, become toll collectors on the basic act of making power usable. Third, thermal and power management providers. High-density compute creates heat. Heat creates a cooling and power conversion problem. That is not glamorous. It is mandatory. Fourth, electrical, control, and distribution equipment. Switchgear, breakers, power modules, and specialty components start behaving like the nervous system of the entire build-out. Fifth, raw materials, transmission lines, conductors. And rebuild cycles pull on aluminum and copper. You do not have to love commodity investing to understand that sustained grid spend changes the demand map. Sixth, nuclear and other baseload enablers. Meta said in January 2026 that it had agreements with Vistra, TerraPower, and Oklo to support nuclear powered infrastructure tied to AI growth, unlocking up to 6.6 gigawatts by 2035. Reuters also reported Meta's agreements with nuclear companies, including Vistra, Oklo, and TerraPower. Again, the exact stock picks are not the lesson. The lesson is that the corporate appetite for firm power is moving from theory into signed commitments. Seventh, financing and execution enablers. Any regime that pushes over $1 trillion toward grid upgrades and reliability improvements creates a whole layer of engineering, procurement, labor, project management, and financing winners around the core build-out. The Department of Energy's March 2026 Spark announcement said it was making approximately $1.9 billion available to accelerate transmission upgrades and grid resilience. That is not the whole grid bill. It is a clue, a directional clue. And good investors learn to respect clues that come with public money attached. Now, at this point, a lot of people make the same mistake. They say, fine, this is already run. Maybe some of it has, but late is not the same thing as wrong. That is the seventh mechanism. I call it the two. Late trap. Amateurs think every good investment must be bought at the exact first whisper. Professionals often prefer to be a little late to something real rather than early to something imaginary. A theme with actual contracts, real government support, visible bottlenecks, and backlog proof can stay investable far longer than people think. Not in a straight line, not without drawdowns, not without rotations, not without valuations getting ugly from time to time. But the presence of an existing run does not automatically end a structurally backed theme. Sometimes it only proves that the market finally noticed what the data had already been whispering. Now, here is where I want to get stricter than the source material. I do not want you turning this into a shopping list. That would be lazy. The real value here is not memorizing 5 or 10 stock symbols. The real value is learning the framework. That is the eighth mechanism. I call it the institutional lens. Institutional money does not ask first, what is the most exciting story? It asks what spend is unavoidable, which layer gets paid first, which names have backlog or contract visibility, which suppliers are hard to replace, which businesses benefit from the trend whether sentiment improves or worsens, which names have run because the market is finally seeing something real, and which have run only because retail wants a mascot. That is a different lens. If you use that lens, you stop being trapped by headlines. You stop saying Trump energy law as though the title is the trade. The title is not the trade. The trade is this. AI is increasing power demand. The grid is older and tighter than people assumed. Government and corporate actors are moving from optional discussion to mandatory spending. And once spending becomes mandatory, the winners broaden far beyond the obvious names everybody was watching. That is the trade. Everything else is packaging. Now let me give you the harsher conclusion. A lot of retail investors are still behaving as though broad index ownership is the whole answer in every environment. Sometimes the index is the right home, sometimes it is only the default parking lot. If an entire subsector of the market is quietly re-rating because real money is being forced into it while the SP drifts, then sitting passively and calling it prudence is not always discipline. Sometimes it is just inattention. That is the ninth mechanism. I call it the hidden rotation problem. Markets are never only one market inside a flat-looking index, entire sub. Industries can be exploding. The public sees the broad number and assumes nothing is happening. Meanwhile, the actual money is already relocating underneath. That is why The market is sideways is often a confession of laziness rather than a description of reality. Somebody is moving somewhere. The question is whether you know where and why. That brings me to the final protocol. If I wanted to use this theme intelligently, I would not start with stock tips. I would start with 5 filters. First, undeniable demand. Not a wish, not a concept, not a cute policy story, real power demand growth and real grid constraints. Second, unavoidable spending, who gets paid because the problem must be solved, not because the narrative is fashionable. Third, backlog or contract proof. Where is the signed work? Where are the public commitments? Where is the evidence that the money is already moving? Fourth, choke point position. Which layer of the stack is difficult to replace? Which suppliers, builders, or operators become more important as the bottleneck worsens? Fifth, survivable entry. Not every stock in a great theme is a great buy on every day. You still need discipline, you still need a position size, you still need to know whether you are buying a business or paying tribute to momentum. That is the whole system. And if you want the cleanest single sentence from this entire story, here it is. AI's first giant fortune was made in chips. Its next giant fortune may be made in electricity. Not because electricity is more glamorous, because once the grid becomes the choke point, the people who relieve the choke point start collecting the rent. That is how capitalism works, not by rewarding whatever the crowd notices first, by rewarding what the crowd cannot ignore last. And right now, the crowd is still talking like the AI boom is weightless. It is not. It is hot. It is heavy. It is physical. It needs power all night. It needs wire. It needs cooling. It needs switching. It needs generation. It needs infrastructure. It needs money. A lot of money. The people who finally understand that stop investing in the theme like fans. They start investing in it like engineers. And engineers usually make better fortunes than fans.